everyone, and welcome to TripAdvisor Tabletop Tuesday edition with your host, me, Jason Tripp. Today, really special treat. I'm joined alongside a special guest all the way from Vermont, Senator Bernie Sanders. Bernie, welcome. Great to have you here with me today. Appreciate you wearing the mittens and the parka and the mask. It is rather chilly here in Northern Ontario this time of year. That being said, this is a board game review channel, and it's going to be a little difficult for me to do a review with my mittens on, so I'm just going to slide over to maintain our social distance and take off my mittens and parka. You're welcome to keep yours on. There we go. Well, today we're taking a look at a game called Pandemic. This game has been around for over a decade, and certainly the mood of this game has changed dramatically since 2020, as we're in the midst of a very real global pandemic. Truth be told, I thought long and hard about whether or not to review this game at all, let alone our first board game review together on this channel. I want to say this up front. In reviewing this game, I don't want to belittle the pandemic in our world. It's certainly not fun and games. That being said, a game like this can not only be an enjoyable experience in playing, but can also lead to discussion and help us grow in our empathy and our care for those around the world. And I think Pandemic can and should serve that purpose today. And so this might not be the game for everyone, and I want to dedicate this particular board game review today to all of the frontline workers, scientists, doctors, nurses, healthcare providers, essential workers, those who are on the front lines doing wonderful and necessary and essential work in the midst of this pandemic. And so I'll take the game to the table. We'll show you how to set it up, how to play it through. We'll come back up here and I'll give some final thoughts, and I'll give Bernie a chance to give some final thoughts as well. Unlike most games that are competitive in nature, in which one player and one player alone is declared the victor at the end of the game, Pandemic is cooperative in nature. It plays 2 to 4 players. We're going to be simulating a 2-player game today. There are also 3 difficulty levels you can play in Pandemic. There's the introductory game, recommended for your first game, the normal game, and the heroic game. For today's purposes, we're simulating a 2-player game using the introductory game difficulty level. And so here's all the components in the game. You've got the game board, which is simply a world map with various locations separated into 4 colors: yellow, blue, black, and red. Those colors correspond to 4 distinct diseases that we are working to cure and eradicate cooperatively in this game. Those diseases are illustrated by these 4 colored cubes: black, yellow, red, and blue. You're going to want to keep those close to the game board when you're setting up. Because we're playing a 2-player game, we're going to shuffle and assign 2 of these roll cards. I should mention that I'm using the first ever printed and produced version of Pandemic. In newer versions, the roll cards will be a little more varied, and some of the artwork on the cards and the components will be a little different, but it is the same game. So I'm going to assign 2 rolls. In this case, I've chosen the researcher and the dispatcher. There's also the medic, the scientist, and the operations expert. Each role has a unique special ability that can be used cooperatively throughout and strategically throughout the game to try and achieve a shared victory. After assigning the roles, we'll find the player pawns that match and correspond to the colors on the cards. In this case, we'll find the pink dispatcher token and the brown researcher token. And we'll take those tokens and we're going to put them in Atlanta along with a research center. These tokens here symbolize research centers. Atlanta, being the center for disease control, is the starting location for all players and the first research center on the board. Next thing we're going to do is we're going to take these 2 green markers here. You have 1 green token that signifies a number of outbreaks that occur throughout the game. You're going to put that on the outbreak track on the bottom left side on number 0 to begin. And you'll take the other green token and place it on the infection rate track on the far left side to begin the game. There are 2 decks of cards in Pandemic, the blue player deck and the green infection deck. Next thing you're going to want to do as part of the setup is you're going to want to take the player deck, which primarily is filled with cities corresponding to the 4 colors. There's also some special event cards. We'll talk about those briefly shortly. But for the setup, you're going to want to find the 6 green epidemic cards and remove them from the deck. Because we are playing the introductory game, we're only going to need 4 of those 6 epidemic cards in play. If we were playing the normal game, we would use 5 of those cards, and if we were playing the heroic game, we would use all 6. So we can discard the 2 we don't need for this game, as well as the additional pawns, player pawns, because we're playing a 2-player game. We won't need those as well. Next thing we'll do, having shuffled the player deck, is we will give each player a starting hand. Because we are playing a 2-player game today, we're going to give each player 4 cards. In a 3-player game, you give each player 3 cards, and in a 4-player game, you would give each player 2 cards. Depending on the difficulty level, you can either choose to keep the player cards open so all players can see the cards, or you can keep them hidden to make a more difficult game. Because we're playing the introductory game, we're now dividing the player deck into 4 piles, and we'll take 1 epidemic card and put in each of those 4 piles. Again, if we were playing the normal or the heroic version, those would be 5 or 6 piles with 5 or 6 epidemic cards in each pile. Now we shuffle the player deck and we put the remaining player cards on the bottom right-hand part of the board. And now we grab the infection deck of cards and we place that in the top right-hand part of the board on the infection card pile. The next step in the setup is putting initial disease cubes on the board. To do that, you're going to want to draw 3 cards from the infection draw pile, place them face up into the infection discard pile. For each card drawn, you're going to want to add 3 cubes of the corresponding color to each pictured city. So the first one we draw here is Kinshasa. It's yellow. So we will draw 3 yellow cubes and we will place them in Kinshasa. We'll repeat that process 2 more times, placing 3 cubes of the corresponding color. Then we'll draw 3 more cards, matching 2 cubes of the corresponding color. Finally, we'll draw 3 more cards and do the same with 1 cube to each city. So here's a sample setup of initial disease cubes of varying degrees and varying colors across the board. Last thing we'll need to do in the setup is we'll need to distribute these special and basic action cards to each player and determine who the starting player is. To determine starting player, each player can look in their hand of cards, looking specifically at the populations of each city in their starting hands. Whichever player has a city with the largest population goes first. And that's the setup. Having set up the game, now we're ready to walk through the basic gameplay of Pandemic. Beginning with the starting player and going clockwise around the table, play proceeds with the current player walking through 3 steps on each turn. The first step is taking up to a maximum of 4 actions. That's followed by drawing 2 cards to add to their hand to a maximum of 7 cards. If drawing 2 cards at the end of their turn would put them over 7 cards, they have to discard down to 7. And then the third step on each player's turn is to take on the role of the infector. First, let's talk about the 4 actions, the possible actions that can be taken by the current player. Those actions are on this card you received at the beginning of the game. One side says basic actions, the other side says special actions. Let's begin first by looking at the various basic actions. The first of the basic actions simply involves driving or ferrying from one location to an adjacent location. Each step is considered one of the 4 actions when driving or ferrying. The second basic action involves taking a direct flight. A direct flight involves discarding a card to move your pawn to the city pictured on the card. So, for example, if the dispatcher here is going first, they can choose to, having this card in their hand, Kinshasa, play that card. It's discarded for the remainder of the game and allows them to directly fly from Atlanta to Kinshasa. The third of the basic options is not a direct flight, but a charter flight. In order to take a charter flight, the active player must discard the card showing their current city and move to any city on the board. So for example, if it is the researcher's turn, and the researcher has Atlanta in their hand, they can choose, because they are in Atlanta, to discard the Atlanta card for the duration of the game, and they can charter a flight to any city on the board. Perhaps they want to go over here to Kolkata because it's been infected with 3 disease cubes to help treat that disease there. That's a charter flight. The final flight option available as a basic option is what's called a shuttle flight. Now, a shuttle flight involves moving to a city containing a research station if your pawn is in a city containing a research station. Of course, at the beginning of the game, there's only one research station in Atlanta, but various research stations probably will be built and constructed throughout the game strategically around the world, allowing you easy access to those cities through a shuttle flight. Those are the basic 4 actions. Now let's look at the special actions. Speaking of research stations, the first special action involves building research stations. In order to build a research station, the active player must discard the card showing your current city to build a research station there. So, if the brown token had in their hand the Kolkata city that they are currently in, they would be able to use one of their 4 actions to build an additional research station in that city. Of course, they would have to discard that card. We'll come back to discovering a cure shortly, but first let's talk about treating diseases. The special action treating diseases involves using one of your 4 actions or up to all 4 of your actions to remove disease cubes from the city your pawn is currently occupying. So in this case, back to this token here, the purple token can use 1, 2, or 3 of their actions to remove those various disease tokens and cubes from the city they are currently in. If and when there's a cure found for one of those 4 colors, they can remove all the color from that city with 1 action treating the disease. The final special action involves sharing knowledge. Sharing knowledge is when a player passes a card to another player. But in order to do that, both the pawns have to be in the same city, and one of the players has to possess the card in which the city they're in. So, for example, if both players were in Cairo and one player had the Cairo card, they would be able to use 1 action to share knowledge, passing the Cairo card to the other player. Now let's get back to discovering a cure. Of course, we're not simply wanting to treat diseases. Ultimately, the game is won or lost in our ability to discover cures. So in order to discover a cure, one player has to have in their hand a number of the same color. If one player possesses 5 of the same color in their hand, they have the ability to discover a cure for that particular color. In order to discover the cure, they have to have 5 of that color in their hand, and they have to be at a research station. So for example, if the brown pawn was at the research station here in Kolkata, and they had 5 of the same color, any color in their hand, they can play those 5 cards on their turn, thus curing a disease. For example, let's say the black disease was cured in this case. We would then take this black token here, and we would slide it down, covering up the black disease to signify we have found a cure for that disease. Those are all the basic and special actions available to players on their turns. After taking a variety of basic or special actions up to a maximum of 4, of course they can choose to pass if they want to take less than 4 actions. The next step on each player's turn will be to draw 2 cards from the player deck and add them to their hand. If this causes them to go more than 7 cards, they simply discard down to 7. In the event that one of the cards drawn is one of the epidemic cards that had been shuffled into the deck initially, you immediately pause the game and do 3 things. The first thing that is triggered by the epidemic, it says on the card here, is to increase the infection rate. And so we simply take this infection rate marker, which began at 2, and we bump that up to the next step. The next thing we do is we infect. And so the infect process involves drawing a card off the bottom of the infection draw pile and infecting the indicated city with 3 cubes. And so, in this case, we'd draw the bottom card, flip it up. In this case, it's Khartoum. So we'll take 3 yellow tokens and we'll put them in Khartoum. The last thing we do is we increase the intensity of infection. That involves taking the discard pile here from the infection draw pile and shuffling all those up. After shuffling them, we then put them on top of the pile. The last step after drawing these cards, whether or not one of these cards is the epidemic, the next step is playing the role of the infector. In playing the role of the infector, the final step in every player's turn, based on the infection rate, which is 2 here at the start of the game, even after the first epidemic, it's 2. That means we draw the top 2 cards, and after drawing the top 2 cards, we place new disease cubes on those cities. So what we will do is we will draw the top 2 cards, and we will proceed to place 1 cube on those cities. So in this case, Washington will receive 1. And because our infection rate is 2, we will draw a second infection card. New York receives a second token. If we were to draw a card that has a corresponding city that already has 3 cubes, and placing a cube there would cause it to be a 4th cube, that triggers an outbreak. In the event of an outbreak, we do not place a 4th cube on the city, but all the adjacent cities receive a cube of that color instead. So in this case, all of the adjacent cities would receive a cube here because of the outbreak in Khartoum. In this case, however, because Kinshasa also has 3 cubes, we have a chain reaction of a second outbreak. So rather than putting a 4th cube there, the outbreak will spread to all the surrounding cities from Kinshasa. And because in this case we have 2 outbreaks, we would then have to move the outbreak token up 2 spaces to number 2. Play continues in that fashion in a clockwise order around the table, with players continuing to strategically take basic and special actions, working to eradicate and cure all of the diseases on the board. The game ends in one of various ways. There are multiple ways in which players can be defeated in Pandemic. The game can end if a player needs to add disease cubes to a board, but there aren't any left of that color. For example, if all of the yellow cubes are already in play, and at the end of our turn, we flipped up a yellow location, there are no more yellow cubes to add to the board, the game ends in defeat. A second way the game can end in defeat is when the 8th outbreak occurs. You see on this outbreak track, if this marker ever gets up to the 8th position, the game ends in defeat as well. Also, if there aren't enough player cards to draw, at the end of a player's turn to go into their hand, that's a 3rd defeat condition at the end of the game. However, victory is attained when players collectively cure all 4 of the diseases, blue, yellow, black, and red. Once they've been discovered, the game ends immediately, and there is no need to eradicate the cubes as all 4 cubes have been discovered. And that is how to play Pandemic in a nutshell. So that's a quick look at Pandemic, a game that was groundbreaking when it came out in 2007. Certainly it's a different vibe and different mood playing the game now as it dovetails with a very real pandemic that we are going through in our world today. I want to give this a quick score, a report card. That's what I'll get into the habit of doing each week, is just a 6-part sort of review of my thoughts about each game that I review every week, starting with the theme. This is one of the strengths of this game. Since the first time I played it, it's an immersive experience. That might be a turn-off for some. I understand that nowadays. Maybe we want to sit down and play a game that has nothing to do with a sobering theme that is a reality in our world. But it's an immersive experience, and it draws you into the game. It's a game that leaves you thinking about it after you finish playing it and discussing it. These days, in particular, talking about the real-life scientists and healthcare workers that this video is dedicated to. So I give the theme an A score, a letter grade. Next, the aesthetics of the game, the visual appeal of the game. As you can see, the artwork on the box pops. It's an appealing visual game. The components are good. It's not the most visually appealing game on my shelf. You'll see a few more of those down the road. But the components are good quality. The artwork is solid, and I give it a B. The replayability of this game, this is another area where this game shines. I've gotten this game to the table dozens and dozens and dozens of times over the years, and it doesn't seem to get old, doesn't seem to get stale. Each time you play the game, it's a unique experience. Because it's a cooperative game, if you get the right group of people around the table, it leads to a memorable experience, and that adds to the replayability of this game. So I give the replayability an A. The game length on the box, let's see, what does it say for game length? It says 45 minutes on the box, and that's about right, give or take 45 minutes, depending on the nature, again, the nature of the group and how much discussion is going on in between turns, especially as it gets down to crunch time in the game. But typically games last anywhere between 35 to 55 minutes. And that seems just about the right length of time for a game of this nature. It doesn't drag, doesn't fly by too quick, so I give that an A as well. The ease of play, and I hope my review did it justice. There's a few moving parts and moving pieces when you first try and wrap your head around the game, but the nature of the game, because the turns are repetitive by nature, it's easy to get familiar with the flow of the game, and so the ease of play is there. Your first time through, you might make a little goof or have to revisit the rulebook or this video, but overall I give it an A- for ease of play. It says 10 plus on the box, age 10 plus. I've played this with my children when they were 7 plus, and they grasp onto it. Because it is a cooperative game, you're working together, so it is conducive to young children. And it actually helps young children understand the nature of the pandemic we're going through now, our shared humanity, our need to work together, our need to get behind and applaud our frontline workers. And so the ease of play, I give an A-. Last but not least, the tactics and the strategy in this game. There are some tactics and strategy going on, and depending on the roles each player has around the table, you'll figure that out when you play a few times. The best strategies for different persons around the table, for example, the scientist and the medic, you want to use them strategically because of their special abilities. And so as you play, as you discuss, you'll find early on, maybe trial and error. If you lose a game, you realize, oh, we should have done that differently, and you go back and replay it again or bump up the difficulty level. And so there is a number of tactics and strategies. The one negative, again, depending on the personalities around the table, and I'm guilty of this from time to time, is that if one person likes to take charge, one person can sort of dominate the decision making in a cooperative game. And if you have some more introverted, shyer people around the table, they may not get a chance to give their 2 cents. And so our house rule, and I think it's a good house rule for any cooperative game, is you're welcome to discuss on everyone's turn, but whoever's turn it is, they are ultimately the one who gets the final say on what they do for their turn. That way everybody gets involved in the tactics and the strategy. So that aside, I give it a B+ on the tactics and strategy. Overall, I give this game an A-. It's one of my favorite cooperative games to date. And as mentioned, there are a number of other cooperative games, a number of other pandemic spin-off games that have spawned as a result of this one. Again, this game is dedicated today to all of those frontline workers. Thank you so much for your hard work. For those of you who are going through a difficult time with the real pandemic, know that you are in my thoughts and prayers as well. And so, last word, let's just all do our part to stay safe. Let's all do our part to try and get over this pandemic, to find a very real cure and to move on. But in the midst of this, stay safe, stay strong, and thank you to all of our healthcare providers for providing healthcare for everyone around the world. Any final thoughts, Bernie? Thank you so much for being with me. I'll give you the last word today. Nothing? All right. Thanks for joining me today, TripAdvisor. Really appreciate you taking time to be with me. Next Tuesday, I'll be back with another board game. Between now and then, I'll have a Theology Thursday and a Film Friday video as well. As always, you can subscribe to my channel, like this video, share it widely with friends and family, and enjoy your time around the table playing Pandemic or whatever game you choose to play this week. Bernie, I love those mittens. Any chance we could trade?